The sound of the monitor flatlining cut through the hospital room like a knife.
Tử Tiên froze.
Her entire body went cold as she stared at the small figure lying on the bed, her son, so tiny, so still. His skin pale under the harsh white lights, wires tangled around his fragile body, machines blinking rapidly like they were struggling to keep up with something slipping away. "Doctor, what's happening?" Her voice broke as she rushed forward, grabbing the edge of the bed, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Please step back," the nurse said urgently, pulling her away. Jack stood at the doorway, not moving, not speaking, just watching, as everything began to fall apart. Heart rate dropping. "Prepare the injection. Move." The room filled with chaos, voices overlapping, footsteps rushing, urgency tightening the air until it became suffocating. Tử Tiên struggled against the nurse's grip. "That's my child. Let me go. Let me go." She screamed, tears streaming down her face, her voice raw, desperate. Jack still didn't move. His eyes were locked on the monitor, on that line, that unstable, trembling line. Because for the first time in a long time, nothing else mattered. Not the distance between them. Not the silence. Not the Cold War that had slowly built walls inside their home. Only him. Their son. "Jack!" Tử Tiên cried, turning toward him, her voice breaking into something almost unrecognizable. "Do something, please." That word, please. He hadn't heard it from her in so long. Not like this. Not filled with fear. Not filled with need. And something inside him snapped. "Save him," Jack said, stepping forward suddenly, his voice low but terrifyingly steady. "Whatever it takes." The doctor didn't respond. Didn't have time. Because the situation was already beyond words. Minutes felt like hours. Seconds felt like forever. Until finally the sound changed. A beep. Then another. Then rhythm. Slow. Weak. But there. Alive. Tử Tiên collapsed to her knees. Her body gave in before her mind could catch up, her hands covering her mouth as she sobbed silently, shaking from head to toe, because she had been holding everything in for so long. Every fear, every pain, every word they never said. And now it was all breaking out at once. Jack stood still. But his hands were trembling. The doctor finally turned. "He's stable for now." For now. Those two words echoed louder than anything else. The room slowly emptied. Machines continued their quiet rhythm. And for the first time in weeks, Jack and Tử Tiên were alone. Together. In the same space. But the silence between them was still there. It hadn't always been like this. There was no explosion. No betrayal. No dramatic moment that tore them apart. Just silence. It started small. A missed conversation. A late night. A tired "we'll talk later." Then another. And another. Until one day there was nothing left to say. They still lived together. Still ate at the same table. Still slept in the same bed. But somewhere along the way they stopped seeing each other. "You should have noticed earlier." Tử Tien's voice broke the silence. Jack didn't respond immediately. She stood by the bed, her back facing him, her eyes still fixed on their son. "He had a fever since yesterday," she continued, her voice low but sharp. "I told you." Jack clenched his jaw. "I was in a meeting. And I was alone." She turned suddenly, her eyes filled with tears. Not just from tonight, but from everything. Like always. The words hit harder than they should have. Because they were true. "I'm working for this family," Jack replied, his voice tight. "And I'm living alone in it," she shot back. Silence. Heavy. Familiar. They stared at each other. But not the way they used to. Not with love. Not with warmth. But like two people trying to remember something that had already slipped away. "When was the last time we actually talked?"
Tử Tiên asked quietly.
Jack didn't answer. Because he didn't know. "When was the last time you asked me if I was okay?" She continued. Still no answer. "When was the last time?" Her voice softened, breaking slightly. "You looked at me like I mattered?" That question landed deep. Jack looked at her. Really looked. For the first time in a long time. And what he saw was not the woman he remembered. Not because she had changed. But because he hadn't been paying attention. Her eyes were tired. Her shoulders tense. Her smile gone. "You didn't say anything," he said finally. It was weak, and he knew it. Tu Tian let out a small broken laugh. I did, she whispered. You just stopped listening. The words hung between them, sharp, unavoidable. From the bed, a small sound. Their son stirred slightly. Both of them turned instantly, at the same time, moving at the same time. Their hands almost touched as they reached for him, and in that brief moment something flickered, something familiar, something they thought was gone. But neither of them said it. Instead, they stepped back. Again, because the distance wasn't just physical. It was built, layer by layer, day by day, silence by silence. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, the machines continued to beep softly. And between them, everything that had been left unsaid still remained. But something had changed. Just slightly. Just enough. Because for the first time, they were both afraid of losing the same thing. And maybe that fear was where everything would begin again. The night stretched on, quiet but heavy, the soft beeping of the monitor becoming the only constant in a room that had witnessed too much in too little time. And for hours neither Jack nor Tu Tian spoke again, yet neither of them left, as if both silently understood that walking away now would mean something worse than the silence they had been living in. Their son shifted slightly in his sleep. A faint cough. Both of them reacted instantly. Tu Tian adjusted the blanket. Jack reached to check the boy's forehead. Their hands met. Warm. Familiar. Still. They froze. For a brief second, neither pulled away. Then slowly they did. But not as quickly as before. I stayed up all night yesterday, Tu Tian said quietly, her voice softer now, no longer sharp, just tired. He kept crying, calling for you. Jack's chest tightened. I didn't know, he admitted. I told you, she replied. Not angry, just stating it. That hurt more. Jack sat down slowly beside the bed, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together tightly, his gaze fixed on the small rise and fall of their son's chest, as if anchoring himself to something real, something that hadn't changed, something he hadn't lost yet. When did we become like this? He asked, almost to himself. Tu Tian didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, really looked, then said, when we stopped choosing each other. The words landed quietly, but deeply. Jack closed his eyes for a second, because that was the truth. There had been no big mistake. No betrayal. Just small moments. Ignored. Delayed. Postponed. Until they disappeared. I thought providing was enough, he said. And I thought staying silent would keep things peaceful, she replied. They both let out a small, almost ironic breath, because both of them were wrong. Another cough. Their son stirred again, his brows tightening slightly as if uncomfortable. Mama, he murmured weakly. Tu Tian immediately leaned closer, gently holding his hand. I'm here. I'm here. The boy opened his eyes slightly. Then, Daddy? That word soft, weak, but clear. Jack froze. For a second, then leaned in closer, his hand trembling as he gently touched his son's hair. I'm here too, he said, his voice low, careful, almost afraid to break the moment. The boy's fingers curled weakly around his. A small smile formed. Then his eyes closed again, but this time peacefully. Tử Tiên what chết? And something inside her shifted, because even after everything, their son still reached for both of them. Not one, not the other, both. He still needs us, she said softly. Jack nodded. We still need each other, he replied. That sentence lingered. Not forced, not dramatic, just real. Tu Tian looked down for a moment, then slowly sat beside Jack. Closer than before. Not touching, but not distant. I was lonely, she admitted quietly. Jack didn't interrupt. I didn't want to complain because I knew you were tired. I knew you were trying, she continued. So I told myself to just endure. Her fingers tightened slightly. But the more I stayed quiet, the further you went. Jack swallowed hard, because he could see it now. Clearly. Painfully. I thought you didn't need me, he said. She turned to him. I always did. That answer came without hesitation, and it broke something inside him. Jack let out a slow breath. Then carefully he reached out. Not quickly, not forcefully, just slowly, and placed his hand over hers. This time she didn't pull away. The silence that followed was different. Not empty, not cold, but fragile, like something being rebuilt. Piece by piece. Hours later, the sky outside began to lighten, soft rays of early morning slipping through the window, painting the room in a warmer tone, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the space between them didn't feel unbearable. Their son slept peacefully, his breathing steady, his small hand still loosely holding onto both of theirs. Jack looked at Tử Tiên. "You said we stopped choosing each other," he said. She nodded slightly. "Then let's choose again," he continued. There was no grand speech,
No dramatic vow.
just a simple decision. But sometimes that was enough. Tử Tiên didn't answer immediately. She looked at him, at their son, at their hands. Then she tightened her fingers slightly around his. A small gesture, but clear. "I don't want us to go back to how we were," she said. Jack nodded. "Neither do I. I want something better." He looked at her. "Then we build it." Outside, the sun rose slowly. Inside, something else did too. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but genuinely. Because love didn't disappear. It just got buried. Under silence. Under distance. Under time. And sometimes all it takes to find it again is one moment, one fear, one realization that losing each other was never worth the silence. Jack leaned his head back slightly, his hand still holding hers, his eyes closing for just a second, not from exhaustion but from something closer to relief. Tử Tiên sat beside him, her shoulder lightly touching his, not moving away this time. And between them their son slept. Peaceful. Safe. Loved. The story wasn't over. There would still be days where words were hard, where silence tried to return, where distance threatened to grow again. But this time they knew. And that changed everything. Because love didn't end. They just stopped listening. And now they finally heard each other again.